A police officer collapsed in his patrol car, and a little girl drove him and his canine partner to the hospital. It all happened in a matter of minutes, when fate placed a courageous child in the right place at the exact right time. What could have ended in tragedy was transformed into a story of courage and determination that few would believe possible. Snow fell silently over Willow Creek, transforming the small town into a frozen fairy tale landscape. Sophie Miller clutched her thin coat against her body as she walked home alone from church choir practice. Her borrowed boots, 2 sizes too big, crunched against the fresh powder on the deserted sidewalks. At 8 years old, she was already used to walking home by herself. Her mother, Rachel Miller, worked late shifts at the downtown diner just to make sure they had enough for rent. As she rounded the corner of the town square, something caught her eye. A police cruiser was parked with its headlights still on, illuminating the flakes of snow that danced in the air. Sophie hesitated, her heart starting to beat faster. Her mother always told her not to talk to strangers, but something about this scene felt wrong. The girl approached cautiously, her small steps leaving faint marks on the untouched snow. Standing on her tiptoes, she managed to peer through the fogged-up window. A man was motionless in the driver's seat, his head lolling to the side. It was Officer Daniel Harris, who sometimes stopped by the diner and smiled at her. Beside him, a large German shepherd shifted restlessly, looking from its handler to the window, as if pleading for help. "Officer!" Sophie rapped on the glass with fingers already numb from the cold. The police dog, Rex, turned immediately, barking loudly. The girl flinched back, startled, but the animal's posture changed the moment their eyes met. The barking stopped, replaced by a low, almost desperate whine. That intuition her mother always said she had, eyes that see the unseen, as Rachel used to joke, told her there was no time to lose. The officer needed help, and on this frozen night, there was no one else around. With trembling hands, Sophie tried the patrol car's handle. To her surprise, the door clicked open. Rex didn't lunge. Instead, he shifted back slightly, as if inviting the small visitor inside. The warmth of the car was a stark contrast to the biting cold of the night, but the relief was short-lived. Up close, Sophie could see that Daniel's breathing was shallow and erratic. "Sir? Officer?" she whispered, touching his arm gently. There was no response. Rex nudged his wet nose against the girl's hand, as if to say he trusted her. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her small shoulders. In that moment, she was no longer just a little girl walking home from choir. She had become the only hope for an unconscious man and his loyal canine partner. Inside the patrol car, Sophie Miller felt her heart pound. Daniel Harris's breathing was uneven, coming in shallow, broken gasps. Rex, the police dog, whined softly beside him, as if begging for help for his human partner. The animal's attentive eyes darted between the unconscious officer and the frightened girl, establishing a silent communication that transcended words. "It's okay, Rex. We're going to help him," Sophie whispered, trying to calm both the dog and herself. With shaky fingers, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket and tried to dial for help. Nothing. The snowstorm battering Willow Creek had knocked out the signal. Panic threatened to overwhelm her for a moment, but the girl took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. Sophie looked at the dashboard, its buttons and lights blinking like distant stars. A memory of sunny Sundays, playing in her father's old truck, flooded her mind. He used to sit her on his lap, letting her hold the wheel while he explained what each button did, back before he left, leaving her with only those fragmented memories and a mother who had to face the world alone. "I can do this," she murmured to herself. The 8-year-old glanced at Daniel again. His skin was pale, a color she knew wasn't right. Time was running out. With a determination surprising for someone so young, Sophie reached for the key still in the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the silent night. Rex barked once, as if in approval. Adjusting the seat was the hardest part. Sophie had to stretch her entire body to reach the lever, pulling the seat forward until her feet could just touch the pedals. Even then, she'd have to stay on her tiptoes to reach the brake. "St. Mary's Hospital," she said aloud, as if making a promise. "We're taking you there." Carefully, she put the vehicle in drive, pulling slowly out of the town square. The snow covered everything in a silent white blanket, making it hard to see. Rex sat bolt upright in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Sophie gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Every bump in the road made her hold her breath, terrified that the movement might make Daniel worse. But she had no choice. St. Mary's was the officer's only hope, and she was determined to get there, no matter what. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to Rex, to Daniel, or to herself. "I promise." The blizzard battered Willow Creek with a relentless fury. The once delicate snowflakes had become a thick, white curtain, crashing against the patrol car's windshield. Sophie Miller could barely see the road ahead, even with the high beams on. Her small hands gripped the steering wheel with all the strength her 8 years could muster, while her feet strained to reach the pedals. Rex remained in the passenger seat, his nose twitching and his eyes locked on the road, as if trying to help guide the way. The police dog, trained to obey only Daniel Harris, seemed to understand the emergency, staying calm beside the little girl. "We're going to make it, Rex. We will," Sophie whispered, more to soothe herself than the animal. Her words formed little clouds of vapor in the cold air. The police radio hissed with static, broken by incomprehensible voices. She fumbled with a few buttons, vaguely remembering movies she'd seen, but no one answered. The storm was likely blocking the signal, just as it had with her cell phone. The deserted streets of Willow Creek were a white labyrinth. At every corner, Sophie hesitated, trying to remember the way to St. Mary's Hospital. A cold knot of fear tightened in her chest. What if she didn't make it in time? What if the officer died because of her? What if she crashed the car? A single tear traced a path down her freckled cheek, freezing almost instantly. It was then that her mother's words echoed in her memory. "When there's no one else, you be the one who helps." It was what Rachel always said in tough times, ever since her father had left them to face their struggles alone. Her father had said the same thing before he disappeared, one of the few good memories she held on to. The little girl took a deep breath and readjusted herself in the seat. Rex turned and let out a low whine, as if offering support. Sophie briefly reached out her right hand and touched the dog's soft fur, drawing courage from him. "We're going to make it," she repeated, this time with more conviction. The cruiser slid dangerously on a turn, but she corrected the wheel with surprising instinct. St. Mary's Hospital was only a few blocks away, if she remembered correctly. She just had to keep going, guided by the inner light her mother always said she had. A quiet courage that was now lighting her way through the most frightening storm Willow Creek had ever seen. After what felt like an eternity driving through the storm, Sophie finally saw the lights of St. Mary's Hospital, blinking through the curtain of snow. The relief was so intense that tears welled in her eyes. With her small hands locked on the wheel, she guided the patrol car to the emergency entrance, parking haphazardly under the yellow awning. The girl shut off the engine with trembling fingers. Her legs barely responded when she tried to get out, her school uniform soaked with sweat despite the biting cold. Rex, showing an almost human sense of urgency, leaped from the car first. The police dog began to bark frantically, running in circles around the vehicle to draw attention. "Help! Please help us!" Sophie shouted, with all the force her 8-year-old lungs could manage. Her small voice cut through the silence of the snowy night. Two nurses, smoking near the entrance, dropped their cigarettes instantly at the surreal sight. A small child climbing out of the driver's side of a police car. A canine barking desperately beside her. When they rushed closer and saw Daniel Harris unconscious in the passenger seat, the shock on their faces was plain to see. He collapsed while he was driving. I couldn't call anyone," Sophie explained, her voice choked with fear and exhaustion. In seconds, the emergency team appeared with a gurney. Dr. Michael Alvarez, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and steady hands, took charge. As the nurses transferred the officer to the stretcher, the doctor knelt briefly in front of Sophie. "You saved his life, you know that?" he said, his calm voice a contrast to the surrounding chaos. "What you did was very brave." Sophie just nodded, unable to speak as she watched Daniel being rushed inside. Rex remained by her side, as if he understood his new mission was to protect the little hero. The doctor quickly organized a team to treat the officer, while a young nurse brought Sophie a blanket and a cup of water. The girl was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline that was now beginning to fade. "What's your name, honey?" the nurse asked. "Sophie Miller," she replied, her eyes fixed anxiously on the doors where Daniel had disappeared. "Don't you worry," the nurse assured her. "Dr. Alvarez is the best we have. Your friend is in good hands." Sophie nodded again, clutching the cup. Rex rested his muzzle on her leg, as if telling her everything would be all right. Together, the girl and the dog waited in silence, united by a bond forged in the snow and fear of that extraordinary night. The automatic doors to the emergency room burst open with a metallic whoosh. The medical team pushed the gurney carrying Daniel Harris at high speed down the sterile, white corridors of St. Mary's Hospital. Sophie Miller ran alongside them, her small steps struggling to keep pace, while Rex trotted faithfully by her side, his nose held high and alert. "Animals are not allowed in the ICU." The sharp voice of a young nurse echoed down the hall as they reached the intensive care unit doors. She held out an arm, creating a human barrier between the dog and his unconscious handler. "Please," Sophie begged, tears welling in her tired eyes. "Rex won't leave his side. He has to stay." Her childish voice trembled with a mix of desperation and resolve that seemed far beyond her 8 years. It was Clara, a nurse with over 30 years of experience at St. Mary's, who appeared at the critical moment. She took in the scene. The exhausted little girl, the unconscious officer, and the dog who, against all expectation, remained disciplined even in the chaos. "Let him in," Clara said with quiet authority, placing a hand on her younger colleague's shoulder. "I've seen this canine before. He has better training than some of our residents." A faint smile softened her words. "But protocol," the young nurse began to protest. "Sometimes, protocol has to make way for common sense," Clara replied, already guiding Sophie and Rex inside. "That dog is part of the treatment now." While the team worked to stabilize Daniel, Sophie sat on a hard plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room. The space was eerily empty at this late hour. Only the distant hum of machinery and the occasional announcement over the PA system broke the oppressive silence. Rex lay at the girl's feet, his warm, furry body offering the only tangible comfort in the cold environment. Every so often, he would lift his head and look at Sophie, as if to make sure she was okay, before settling back down, ever watchful. Little Sophie stared at the ICU doors, her fingers absently stroking the dog's ears. Inside her chest, emotions too big for her small body swirled. Fear, hope, pride, and a strange sense of duty. She had driven a police car through a blizzard to save a man she barely knew. Now, sitting in that uncomfortable chair, she was just beginning to process the magnitude of what she had done. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes with cruel slowness, while invisible yet profound bonds were quietly forming in that empty waiting room. Rachel Miller was clearing the last table of her shift when the diner's telephone rang, shrill and demanding. Normally, the late-night calls were from drunk customers wanting delivery, but the serious tone in the voice on the other end of the line made her stomach sink. "Mrs. Miller? This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your daughter, Sophie, is here." The world stopped. Questions tumbled over one another in her mind as the operator vaguely explained an incident involving a police officer. Rachel didn't wait for details. She ripped off her coffee-stained apron, dropped a tray of dishes on the counter, and yelled to her manager that it was an emergency. The $15 tip a family had left sat forgotten on the table. The snow punished her ankles as she ran through the deserted streets. The biting wind sliced through her thin jacket, but the fear of what might have happened to Sophie was a fire that kept the cold at bay. The hospital lights seemed impossibly distant, as if each step took her further away, not closer. When she finally burst through the automatic emergency doors, Rachel was breathless, with melted snow dripping from her hair. The receptionist pointed her down the hall to the right, where a police officer stood guard. The single mother's heart hammered against her ribs. As she rounded the corner, the scene that greeted her left her paralyzed. Sophie, her little Sophie, only 8 years old, was curled up asleep in a plastic chair far too big for her small frame. More astonishing still was the enormous police dog lying at the girl's feet, a watchful guardian. The animal lifted its head as Rachel approached, but didn't bark. It just watched her with intelligent eyes, as if weighing her intentions. "He hasn't left her side for a minute," a passing nurse whispered. "I've never seen anything like it." Rachel fell to her knees before her daughter, gently touching her face. Sophie stirred, her eyes puffy with exhaustion. "Mom?" she murmured. And then she threw herself into Rachel's arms, sobbing quietly. The relief of holding her daughter safe was tangled with a rising terror. What was Sophie doing out alone at night? How had she gotten involved with a police officer? And why was a police canine protecting her as if they were old friends? As she held her daughter, Rachel noticed the stares of the hospital staff, the whispers, the looks of admiration directed at the little girl. Sophie, always so shy and invisible to the world, had somehow become the center of attention. "What happened, my love?" Rachel asked, pulling back to look into her daughter's eyes. "Why are you here?" The dog, Rex, according to the tag on his collar, moved closer and rested his muzzle on Sophie's knee, as if offering courage. The waitress realized, with a mixture of pride and terror, that her little girl had done something extraordinary on this frozen night. Rachel Miller wrapped Sophie in her trembling arms, clutching her to her chest, as if the embrace alone could shield her from all the fear she had faced. The words died in her throat, replaced by a knot of conflicting emotions. Pride, terror, gratitude, and guilt churned in her mother's heart. The hospital's antiseptic scent hung heavy in the air, making the reality of it all feel even more raw. Sophie, exhausted by the weight of the responsibility she had carried, let her tears fall silently. Her small shoulders shook as she sobbed against her mother's waitress uniform, still bearing the coffee stains from her rushed departure from the diner. Rex remained vigilant at her side, his muzzle occasionally nudging the girl's hand, offering comfort in his own silent way. "Your daughter is extraordinary," said Dr. Alvarez, his soft-soled shoes quiet on the linoleum floor. "Daniel Harris wouldn't have survived without her intervention. We're talking about a matter of critical minutes." Rachel simply nodded, unable to articulate the whirlwind of her emotions. She ran her fingers through Sophie's hair, noticing how it seemed heavier, weighted down by the burden her daughter had shouldered. "Thank you, doctor," she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. She's always been like this. She sees everything, feels everything." The doctor offered a gentle smile, his tired eyes reflecting years of emergencies and miracles witnessed within these walls. Some are born with that gift. Her intuition saved a life today. When Dr. Alvarez had gone, Rachel finally allowed herself to truly look at her daughter. In Sophie's eyes, still wet with tears, was a maturity that broke her heart. At 8 years old, her little girl already knew the weight of decisions that most adults would fear to make. "You shouldn't have to do this," Rachel whispered, tucking a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "You shouldn't have to be so strong, so soon." Sophie just shrugged, a gesture so adult it made Rachel swallow hard. "Someone had to help," she replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. In the silence that followed, mother and daughter shared an unspoken truth. Life had forced Sophie to grow up too fast. Ever since her father left, ever since the late bills and the skipped meals to make sure there was enough left for her, the girl had learned to carry invisible burdens, to solve problems far beyond her years. Rex rested his head in Sophie's lap, and she buried her fingers in his thick, soft fur. In that moment, Rachel realized her daughter had found a connection that perhaps even she couldn't offer, the silent understanding of one who protects without question. And that, more than anything, weighed on her mother's heart. St. Mary's Hospital was a whirlwind of activity by dawn. Police cruisers were parked at the emergency entrance, and reporters armed with microphones had turned the quiet lobby into a makeshift command center. Frank Donovan arrived shortly after 8, his graying hair a stark contrast to his immaculate uniform. The lieutenant carried a briefcase and wore an expression that tolerated no argument. "We need to understand exactly what happened," the investigator explained to the medical team as he walked toward the room where Sophie Miller waited with Rex. The police dog's ears twitched at the approach of strangers, and he positioned himself protectively beside the girl. Sophie sat in a visitor's chair, her legs dangling, not quite reaching the floor. Rachel stood beside her, a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes tracking every move of the newcomers. "Hello, Sophie. I'm Lieutenant Donovan," he said, crouching to meet her at eye level. "I know it's been a tough night, but I need you to tell me everything you saw." The girl looked to her mother, who gave an encouraging nod. In a voice that was quiet but steady, Sophie described finding Daniel unconscious in the cruiser, the panic of realizing her phone had no signal, and the decision to drive to the hospital. I saw the patrol car stopped with its lights on. When I got close, Rex was barking, she explained, stroking the dog's fur. Rex responded with a slight wag of his tail. What impressed Donovan wasn't just the child's courage, but the precision with which she recalled every detail. The exact spot where she found the vehicle, Officer Harris's position, even the moment she realized something was wrong with his breathing. "Did you notice anyone suspicious in the area? Any other cars?" the lieutenant asked, taking meticulous notes. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, as if mentally revisiting the scene. There was a dark car pulling out of a side street, but it was snowing really hard. Rex, who hadn't left the girl's side, seemed to validate every word with subtle movements of his head, as if he too were giving his testimony. Rachel watched the interaction with a mix of pride and concern. "My daughter has answered enough for today," she finally interjected, noticing the fatigue in Sophie's eyes. Donovan nodded, closing his notepad. As he left, he couldn't help but notice how Rex settled back at the girl's feet, ever vigilant, ever protective. It was clear the bond forged between them went far beyond the traumatic event. It had become a silent partnership built on mutual trust. "I'll be back tomorrow," the lieutenant said from the doorway. "You were both very brave." The news about Willow Creek's little hero spread like wildfire. In less than 2 days, the story of Sophie Miller, the 8-year-old girl who drove a police car to save an unconscious officer, was the main topic of conversations on every corner of the city. News vans from local stations parked outside St. Mary's, their reporters eager for a glimpse of the girl or an exclusive statement. Sophie shrank every time a camera pointed in her direction. Rex, sensing her discomfort, would strategically place himself between her and the strangers, a furry shield of protection. Rachel tried to field the interview requests, but the pressure was constant. The principal of Sophie's school called, proposing a special ceremony. "We want to honor Sophie's exceptional courage," she explained enthusiastically. Even the mayor had confirmed his attendance. Rachel hesitated, knowing her daughter all too well. Sudden popularity was the last thing the shy little girl would ever want. On the third day, a local news reporter managed to approach Sophie in the hospital corridor as she waited for an update on Daniel. With a microphone in her hand and a cameraman at her side, the woman knelt to the girl's level. "What went through your mind when you decided to drive that car? Weren't you scared?" Sophie looked down at her shoes, her restless hands fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. Rex moved closer, nudging her hand with his muzzle as if to offer courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I just didn't want to lose anyone else." 5 simple words that silenced the entire hallway. The reporter, usually unflappable after years of covering tragedies, felt her throat tighten. The cameraman lowered his camera for a moment, touched by the raw sincerity. Frank Donovan, who happened to be walking down the hall, stopped in his tracks when he heard her. The lieutenant, known for his tough exterior, disguised the glint of moisture in his eyes by adjusting the badge on his uniform. Later, at the diner, he would remark to his colleagues that the little girl had more courage than many seasoned officers. Sophie's words were printed on the front page of the local paper the next day. No fanfare, no sensationalism. Just the pure truth from a child who already knew too much about loss. In response, the people of Willow Creek began leaving letters, drawings, and small gifts at the hospital reception, each with a message of gratitude. Rachel saved every single one, knowing that one day, when the chaos subsided, Sophie would understand the impact of her act of courage on a snowy night. In the depths of sedation, Daniel Harris was reliving the same nightmare that had tormented him for 3 years. Fragmented images of a failed rescue flashed through his mind like painful strobes: a burning house, desperate screams, and the small body of 6-year-old Tommy Wilson, whom he hadn't been able to save in time. The officer had run into the collapsing building, ignoring safety protocols, but the roof had given way seconds before he could reach the boy. Guilt had been a constant shadow in his life ever since. Even as his body fought to recover in St. Mary's Hospital, his mind remained trapped on that fateful day in Willow Creek. The doctors kept Daniel sedated to aid his recovery, but the medicine couldn't ward off the ghosts that haunted him. "You promised you'd come back," Tommy's voice would whisper in his fever dreams. "You said you'd save me." Between moments of partial consciousness, the officer heard distant voices: Dr. Alvarez discussing his case, nurses checking his vitals, and occasionally, the familiar sound of claws scratching on the hospital floor. Rex, ever watchful, refused to abandon his human partner. On the 4th day of his stay, the sedation was gradually reduced. Daniel blinked his eyes open, the fluorescent light of the room feeling unnaturally bright. His throat was dry, and every breath was an effort. When he finally managed to focus on his surroundings, he saw something he never would have expected. Sophie Miller was sitting quietly in the chair beside his bed, with Rex lying faithfully at her feet. The girl offered a shy smile when she saw he was awake. She said nothing, just watched him with those intuitive eyes that seemed to see past the surface of things. The police dog immediately lifted his head, his ears perked at the slightest movement from his partner. Daniel felt silent tears stream down his face. They weren't tears of physical pain, but of a profound understanding that hit him like a weapon bust. The universe had given him a second chance. This time he hadn't been the rescuer. He had been saved by a brave child who had risked everything to help him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raspy, the words barely audible. Sophie just nodded, understanding without needing any explanation. Rex came closer, resting his muzzle on the edge of the hospital bed. The trio remained in silence, united by a bond that transcended words. In that moment, Daniel knew that Tommy Wilson could finally rest in peace. He couldn't change the past, but the present offered a chance at a redemption he had never imagined possible. Sophie Miller entered the ICU room with hesitant steps, holding her mother's hand tightly. The smell of disinfectant and the constant beeping of the machines made her own heart beat a little faster. Daniel Harris lay in the hospital bed, noticeably paler than usual, with tubes and wires connected to his body. Beside him, Rex sat on the floor, alert to every movement. When the little girl entered, the police dog's ears perked up, and he gave a slight wag of his tail, as if recognizing an ally. "Hello," Sophie whispered, stopping a few feet from the bed. Daniel turned his head slowly. When he recognized his small visitor, his tired eyes lit up. A faint but genuine smile touched his lips. "Brave little girl," he murmured, his voice hoarse as he reached a trembling hand toward her. Rachel gave her daughter a gentle nudge, encouraging her to step forward. Sophie moved closer and shyly placed her small hand in the officer's. The contrast was stark. The child's small, warm hand against the cold, pale fingers of the man she had saved. Neither spoke for a long moment. No words were needed. The silence between them carried more meaning than any elaborate speech ever could. Rex, sensing the gravity of the moment, drew near and rested his muzzle on the edge of the hospital bed, as if wanting to be part of their connection. "Thank you," Daniel finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Rex," he paused, searching for the right words. "You're my guardian angels." Sophie offered a timid smile, her eyes downcast. "Rex helped a lot. He's very smart." Hearing his name, the police dog moved closer to the girl, as if he understood every word. Daniel watched the interaction between them, tears welling in his eyes. "You two make a good team," the officer commented, gently squeezing Sophie's hand. From the doorway, Rachel watched, moved and surprised by the depth of the bond forming before her. It was as if these three souls, her daughter, the police officer, and the animal, shared something beyond words. When it was finally time to leave, Sophie was reluctant to let go of Daniel's hand. Sensing her hesitation, the patient promised, "I'll get better soon, and then we can take Rex for a walk in the park." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with hope. As she left the room, Sophie knew, somehow, that this meeting marked the beginning of something important. A friendship born of courage and fate, strengthened by gratitude and a mutual understanding that transcended words. Rachel Miller stared at her cold coffee in the St. Mary's Hospital cafeteria, torn by conflicting emotions. Her fingers drummed nervously on the cup as she watched Sophie talking to Rex in the hallway. Her gratitude for the officer who was now smiling at her daughter was undeniable. But years of raising Sophie alone had taught Rachel to be wary of outside help. "May I sit?" Daniel Harris asked, leaning slightly on a makeshift cane. The officer was still pale, but his eyes held a determination that Rachel recognized in herself. "Of course," she replied, moving her worn handbag from the adjacent seat. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Daniel watched Sophie playing with Rex, the girl finally smiling after days of tension. "She saved my life," he said at last. "I wish I could repay her somehow." Rachel adjusted her diner uniform, feeling a flush of discomfort. "You don't owe us anything." Sophie did what anyone would have done. "Forget it." "No." Daniel shook his head. "It wasn't just anyone. It was your daughter. An 8-year-old girl who drove a squad car in a blizzard when adults just drove right by." The waitress swallowed hard, the thought of the bills stacked at home and the eviction notice hidden in her kitchen drawer flashing through her mind. Pride and need were waging a silent war within her. In the days that followed, they would run into each other in the waiting room. Daniel would bring hot chocolate for Sophie and decent coffee for Rachel. They talked about trivial things, the improving weather, town news, Rex's antics. One afternoon, as Sophie slept with her head in her mother's lap, Daniel spoke softly. "My sister works at the municipal clerk's office. They're looking for someone. The pay is better than at the diner." Rachel felt her face burn. "Did you investigate our situation?" "I didn't have to. I know the signs," he replied, showing her his own calloused hands. "I grew up with a single mother, too." The confession disarmed her. For the first time in years, Rachel allowed herself to consider accepting help, not as charity, but as a gesture of mutual respect. Between shared coffees and hesitant conversations, a fragile trust began to bloom. They both carried scars from the past, but in each other, they found a mirror of their own struggles. What united them, beyond the extraordinary circumstances, was a sincere desire to protect Sophie. As they left the hospital that night, their hands brushed accidentally while holding the door. Neither of them pulled away. The brief contact said more than words ever could. Perhaps there was room to heal old wounds while building new bonds. The civil police veterinarian was firm. Daniel Harris needed absolute rest, and Rex too required a break after the stressful ordeal. He needs a quiet environment for a few weeks, the vet explained, watching as the police dog paced restlessly around the clinic. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before looking at Sophie Miller. "Would you take care of him for me?" he asked, his voice still weak from his long hospital stay. The girl's eyes lit up as never before. She nodded with such conviction that Rachel didn't have the heart to object, despite her worries about the limited space in their small apartment. On his first night at the Millers, Rex circled the apartment several times, sniffing every corner as if mapping the territory. When Sophie finally lay down, exhausted from the events of the past weeks, the dog positioned himself strategically at the foot of her bed, his watchful eyes fixed on the door. "He's protecting us," Sophie whispered to her mother, who watched from the threshold with a mix of gratitude and awe. A routine quickly formed. In the mornings, Rex would walk Sophie to the school bus stop, sitting patiently until he saw her climb aboard. He would return to stay with Rachel until she left for her shift at the diner. The neighbors, initially surprised by the police dog's presence, soon grew accustomed to the sight of the animal faithfully awaiting the girl's return from school. "Have you seen the way he never takes his eyes off her?" Mrs. Peterson remarked to her husband as they watched from their window. "It's like he was born to protect her." At school, Sophie gained a confidence she'd never had before. The children who used to ignore her now vied for the seat next to her in the cafeteria, eager to hear stories about Rex. "He understands everything I say," she would explain, a quiet pride in her voice. At night, when nightmares of the blizzard and the unconscious officer still haunted her, it was the warmth of Rex at her feet that brought her back to reality. The animal's rhythmic breathing had become her lullaby. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. In the market, at the pharmacy, and especially at the diner where Rachel worked, the question hung in the air. Who had really saved whom that night? Daniel visited them regularly, bringing special food or toys for Rex. He watched, with quiet emotion, how the dog and the girl had developed a language of their own, made of subtle glances and gestures. "I've never seen him so happy," he confessed to Rachel during one of his visits. Maybe he needed her as much as she needed him. For the first time since her father had left, Sophie no longer felt alone in the world. With Rex by her side, even the grayest days in Willow Creek seemed a little brighter. Rachel Miller held the summons from the school between trembling fingers as she waited outside the principal's office. The buzz in the hallways was unmistakable. Everyone wanted to see the hero girl's mother. When she was finally shown in, Principal Sylvia Winters greeted her with a strained smile. "Mrs. Miller, we're concerned about the impact of this exposure on Sophie. She barely speaks in class. She refuses to participate in the tributes, and some of her classmates have started treating her differently." Rachel sighed. It was exactly what she had feared. Sophie had always been reserved, but now she had retreated even further, like a clam protecting its pearl. "I understand your concern, but my daughter never wanted the spotlight. She just did what she thought was right in that moment." Back at the diner, Rachel noticed the stares and whispers. The diner, once her refuge, had become a stage for speculation. She put on her apron and tried to ignore two regular customers who lowered their voices when they saw her. "I hear they're about to lose their house. Poor thing, so brave and living in that situation." The words cut like glass. Rachel dropped a tray, the crash momentarily silencing the room. Her coworker, Patty, rushed over to help her pick up the shards. "Don't listen to them," she whispered. "Small people need to tear others down to feel big." That night, as Sophie slept with Rex standing guard at the foot of her bed, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, spreading out overdue bills. Rent, electricity, school supplies. It was all piling up like the snow outside. Daniel Harris, still recovering, learned of their situation through Frank Donovan. The lieutenant had casually mentioned that the Miller family was facing financial hardship and that the risk of eviction was real. "I can't just give them money," Daniel mused, stroking Rex during a visit. The dog, sensing his unease, rested his muzzle on his hand. "But I have to do something." The next day, Daniel called an old academy classmate who now worked at the municipal clerk's office. There was an administrative position open, something stable that could change Rachel's life. Without revealing his involvement, he made sure the information reached her through the local newspaper. Meanwhile, at school, Sophie was fighting her own silent battle. The girl who had driven a police car through a blizzard was now struggling against something just as frightening: the unwanted attention and the pressure to be special when all she wanted was to be normal. The news came like a bucket of cold water. Daniel Harris, who had seemed to be recovering well, had suffered a severe relapse. A post-operative infection had taken hold silently, undermining the progress of the past few weeks. Sophie was at school when Rachel got the call from St. Mary's. "We have to go back to the hospital," Rachel explained to her daughter, trying to keep her voice steady. "Daniel isn't doing well." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. After everything they had been through, the thought of losing the officer was unbearable. Rex, who was temporarily in their care, seemed to sense the change in the air. The police dog grew restless, sniffing at Sophie's backpack and whining softly, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. At the hospital, Dr. Alvarez explained the situation bluntly. "The infection is resistant to the antibiotics we were using. We need to change his treatment and monitor him in the ICU." Rex, normally obedient, flatly refused to leave the room. Not even the firm commands of the other officers who came to visit their colleague worked. The animal lay down beside the bed, his eyes fixed on Daniel, as if his very presence could ward off the danger. "He senses that Daniel needs him," Sophie whispered to her mother as they watched from the half-open door. That night, alone in her room, the 8-year-old girl stared at the ceiling, replaying the events that had brought them all together. It was then that a simple but profound understanding took shape in her mind. She didn't have to face everything alone. Asking for help wasn't weakness. It was courage. The next morning, Sophie found Rachel in the kitchen. "Mom, we need to do something. Can we visit Daniel every day? Bring him things he likes?" The waitress looked at her daughter with admiration. Amidst her own exhaustion and financial worries, Rachel recognized the importance of this moment. "Of course we can, sweetie." And so a new routine began. Every day after school, mother and daughter went to the hospital. They brought small gifts, drawings made by Sophie, a warmer blanket for the cold days, music that Daniel had mentioned he liked. Nurse Clara, always sympathetic, allowed them to stay a few minutes past visiting hours. The ICU room, once sterile and impersonal, gained touches of life. Photos of Rex, colorful drawings, and even a small vase with flowers from the school garden transformed the space. "You bring warmth," Daniel murmured one afternoon, when he finally managed to stay awake for a longer stretch. "You and Rex, you're my strength now." Sophie smiled, holding the officer's hand. She had learned that saving someone didn't just happen in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it was a slow process, made of small, daily gestures of hope. Monday morning brought news that changed the course of the investigation. Frank Donovan gathered his team at the Willow Creek precinct to announce the capture of the suspect in the attack on Daniel Harris. The lieutenant, his gray hair disheveled after sleepless nights, looked relieved, but his stern gaze suggested something else was bothering him. "We discovered that the ambush was no coincidence," Frank revealed to the silent room. "The dispatch system sent the wrong coordinates to Daniel's squad car that night. He was directed to an isolated area with no backup." The news spread like wildfire through the small town. Rachel Miller heard it while setting tables at the diner, as two officers discussed the case over their morning coffee. She felt an immediate sense of relief for Daniel, but also a pang of indignation at the failure that had nearly cost a man his life. At the hospital, Daniel received a visit from the lieutenant. "It wasn't your fault," Frank said, handing him the official report. "The system failed you." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of guilt finally begin to lift. Rex, lying beside the bed, raised his head, as if he too understood the significance of the moment. Sophie heard about it at school when her teacher mentioned the story from the local paper. The girl remained quiet, but her eyes shone. She had believed in Daniel from the very beginning, even without fully understanding what had happened. The community of Willow Creek, outraged by the institutional failure, organized a petition demanding changes to the police department's safety protocols. The mayor, pressured by residents and the local press, called an emergency meeting with the police command. On Thursday, the chief of police addressed the press in front of the precinct. With a steady voice, he issued a public apology for the incident and announced a complete overhaul of their dispatch and communication protocols. "What happened to Officer Harris is unacceptable, and it will not be repeated," he vowed, looking directly into the cameras. That evening, Daniel was discharged from the hospital. Rachel and Sophie were waiting for him at the exit, where Rex leaped with joy at the sight of his handler on his feet again. The officer smiled, still weak, but with a weight visibly lifted from him. "It's over," he said, taking Sophie's small hand in his. "Now we can move forward." The little girl nodded, understanding that the word "we" now included all of them, bound together by extraordinary circumstances and a shared desire to rebuild their lives. The principal of Willow Creek Elementary, a Mrs. Winters, called Rachel Miller in for a special meeting. With a proud smile, she announced that Sophie had been selected for a full scholarship to the prestigious Westfield Academy, 40 miles out of town. The program sought out exceptional talents, and the little heroine's courage had captured the committee's attention. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest. This was the kind of opportunity she could never have afforded on a waitress's salary. New uniforms, skilled teachers, modern labs, everything Sophie deserved. When she got home, she found Sophie sitting on the living room rug, reading a book with Rex lying at her side. "I have incredible news," Rachel said, explaining the scholarship. But her maternal enthusiasm was met with a simple question from Sophie. Could Rex go with her? "Honey, it's a boarding school. Animals aren't allowed," Rachel explained, trying to mask her own disappointment. Sophie fell silent for a few moments, stroking the police dog's fur. Then, with a maturity that defied her 8 years, she replied, "I don't trade my friends for medals." The decision surprised everyone. Daniel Harris, still recovering, visited the Miller house when he heard about it. He knelt in front of Sophie, meeting her gaze. "Are you sure about this? It's a once-in-a-lifetime chance," the officer asked gently. Rex stayed with me when I needed him. Now it's my turn, the girl answered, wrapping her arms around the dog. The news spread quickly through the small town of Willow Creek. Sophie's teacher, moved by her students' loyalty, shared the story during a meeting at the Baptist church. Frank Donovan, who was in attendance, stood up unexpectedly. If a child can show this much integrity, what are we, the adults, doing? The lieutenant challenged, pulling $50 from his wallet. I'm starting a fund to improve our own public school. In a matter of weeks, the movement gained momentum. Local merchants, including the owner of the diner where Rachel worked, organized fundraisers. The community rallied around a common goal: to make their municipal school a place worthy of the potential of Sophie and all the other children. Daniel, watching it all unfold from his home as he recovered, realized that true heroism wasn't just in the extraordinary act on that snowy night, but in the simple values Sophie championed: loyalty, friendship, and the feeling of belonging to something greater than oneself. The first signs of spring began to break through in Willow Creek, melting the last traces of the snow that had witnessed that fateful night. Rachel Miller smiled as she adjusted her name badge at the municipal clerk's office for the very first time. After 3 interviews and a strong recommendation from Daniel Harris, she had finally left the uncertain world of trays and tips behind. "You deserve this," Daniel said, waiting for her outside on her first day. Rex wagged his tail beside him, as if in agreement. The officer, now fully recovered, made a point of walking with her to the school to pick up Sophie. The new job meant much more than financial stability. For Rachel, it represented a reclaiming of the dignity that years of silent judgment had stolen. In the halls of the clerk's office, no one looked at her with pity or intrusive curiosity. She was just a competent employee, a dedicated mother, a woman rebuilding her life. The afternoons in the Miller apartment changed too. There were no more bills piled on the kitchen table, no gnawing fear of not making rent. Sophie could finally have friends over to study, while Rex stood patient guard by the door. The transformation extended throughout the town. The diner where Rachel had worked for years became an impromptu gathering spot for celebrations. When the public school received new computers, thanks to the campaign Sophie's Choice had inspired, it was there that teachers and parents met to raise a glass. "Who knew it would take a snowstorm to melt the ice between people?" remarked Clara, the nurse, over coffee with Frank Donovan. The lieutenant, a little less stern these last few months, nodded in agreement. Daniel visited the Millers almost daily, bringing small gifts: a book for Sophie, flowers from the precinct's garden for Rachel, special treats for Rex. On his nights off, they would have dinner together, slowly building a routine that none of them dared to name, but all of them cherished. One of those nights, as Sophie slept and Rex stood watch at the foot of her bed, Rachel confessed her deepest fear to Daniel. "What if I can't hold all this together on my own?" The officer took her hand across the kitchen table. "You'll never be alone again," he answered, with the same certainty that had guided Sophie in the patrol car that winter night. "None of us will." Willow Creek, once just a place on a map, was finally becoming a home for them all. The Willow Creek Baptist Church was decorated with an elegant simplicity. Small white lights woven through the pillars cast a welcoming glow, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. The recognition ceremony had been planned with discretion, respecting Sophie Miller's wish to avoid the spotlight. Sophie nervously smoothed out the navy blue dress her mother had bought for the occasion. She had only agreed to attend after Daniel Harris promised he would be right by her side, along with Rex. The dog, normally not allowed in a house of worship, had been granted a special exception by Pastor Williams, who felt the trio's story was remarkable enough to bend the rules. Rachel watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. In the past few months, she had witnessed the girl transform, still shy but now possessing a quiet confidence that shone in her eyes. The waitress had traded her diner uniform for a simple but elegant dress, feeling for the first time in years like she was part of something bigger than her own daily struggles. Lieutenant Frank Donovan, his formal suit replacing his usual uniform, led the ceremony with a warm solemnity. When he called Daniel to the small, improvised stage, the officer walked with a slightly hesitant gait, a lingering effect of the infection that had nearly taken him. What happened on that snowy night wasn't just a rescue, Daniel began, his voice firm despite the emotion welling within him. It was a reminder that heroism comes in all sizes. He looked directly at Sophie, who blushed deeply. This extraordinary girl not only drove a patrol car for the first time in her life, but she taught us about courage when all signs pointed to the impossible. The hall, filled only with close friends and family, Dr. Alvarez, Clara, a few fellow officers, neighbors, and Sophie's teachers, listened in respectful silence. But heroism rarely acts alone, the officer continued. Rachel's quiet strength, raising a daughter of such character on her own, deserves just as much recognition as the act itself. His eyes met Rachel's, conveying a message that words could not. Daniel then bent down to pet Rex, who remained seated faithfully beside Sophie. And this partner, he said, who recognized an ally when we needed one most. When he finished his speech, the room erupted in heartfelt applause. Sophie, her eyes glistening, accepted a small certificate of honor, but immediately shared it with Rex, holding it between them as she hugged the dog's neck. The human warmth that filled the room that night seemed to melt the very last traces of the harsh winter that had brought their unlikely lives together. The first rays of April's sun melted the final layers of snow in Willow Creek. Wildflowers began to peek through the flower beds in the town square, as if testing whether it was safe to emerge after the long winter. Sophie Miller watched the transformation with wonder as she walked hand in hand with her mother, Rex sniffing the air with renewed enthusiasm at her side. The Miller home, once quiet and cold, now overflowed with life. Rachel was preparing Sunday dinner while Daniel Harris adjusted a new bookshelf in the living room, a simple project that symbolized something much greater: permanence. The aroma of stew filled the air, mingling with laughter from the kitchen, as Rex tried to sneak a piece of carrot that had fallen to the floor. "Don't even think about it, mister," Sophie teased, but her affectionate tone betrayed any attempt at a scolding. The police dog, now officially transferred to work with Daniel full-time, thumped his tail as if he understood the joke perfectly. Tuesday nights became sacred for board games, where Rachel revealed a surprising talent for strategy. On Saturdays, they walked together through the town park, where Sophie would invent stories about the clouds for an ever-attentive Daniel, who never treated her imagination as childish or silly. At school, she was no longer just the snowstorm hero. She was simply Sophie, the girl who loved books about astronomy and had a dog who waited faithfully for her at the gate every afternoon. Rachel, now a clerk at the municipal office, came home with a less tense face, her shoulders lighter. Lieutenant Donovan would stop by occasionally for coffee, bringing news from the precinct and homemade cookies from his wife. Even Dr. Alvarez and Clara the nurse became steady presences at the small celebrations that now filled the modest home. On one particularly sunny afternoon, as he watched Sophie teach Rex new tricks in the yard, Daniel quietly took Rachel's hand. No words were needed, just a shared look that spoke of gratitude, of new beginnings, of fears overcome. "I think I finally get it," Sophie said that night, as she settled into bed with Rex at her feet. "Get what, honey?" Rachel asked, tucking in her blanket. "That family isn't just who you're born to," she said. "It's the people who choose to stay." The simple wisdom in her words brought tears to Rachel's eyes. Here in Willow Creek, where it had all started with a snowstorm and a police car, three once lonely hearts had found shelter in one another. They were learning, day by day, that true heroism lay not in a single act of bravery, but in the small, patient gestures of love, repeated over and over, like snowflakes that together transform an entire landscape.